Welcome back to Secrets Exposed. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. You're the reason these stories worth sharing. Tell us where you're watching from, city or country. We're amazed by how far these tales reach. Subscribe our channel and press bell icon to get daily new and amazing stories for you. Alright, let's begin. The night air was colder than it should have been for early spring. A restless wind pushed grit across the patio stones as Mark Reynolds unlatched the side gate and stepped into his own backyard. His suitcase bumped against his leg, the wheels clicking over uneven stones. He wasn't supposed to be home until midnight, but the client dinner had been canceled and he'd caught an earlier flight. He didn't text Julia. Part of him wanted to surprise her, to walk in and find his little boy already asleep, maybe kiss his forehead before settling down. He paused at the porch light. That's when he heard it. Thin, jagged breaths carried on the wind. At first, he thought it was the neighbor's dog panting through the fence, but then he caught the sound again, sharper this time, edged with a faint whimper. His chest tightened. He set the suitcase down and moved toward the shed at the far corner of the yard, where the shadows pooled darkest. There, against the splintered plywood wall, was Noah. The boy was only 6, small for his age, his knees pulled tight against his chest. His lips were tinged blue, his socks damp from the grass. He was trembling so violently that his teeth made a faint clatter, a sound Mark would never forget. "God, Noah," Mark whispered, tearing off his coat. He wrapped around the boy and crouched low, pulling him into his arms. Noah's little fingers clung to his father's shirt like a drowning swimmer clutching driftwood. The shed loomed behind them, its padlock glinting in the moonlight. Mark glanced at the house. The glow of the television pulsed against the curtains. Through the kitchen window, he could see Julia, his wife, and Elaine, his mother-in-law, sitting comfortably at the table. Plates of food steamed in front of them, glasses of wine in hand. They laughed at something on the TV, oblivious. Mark's throat tightened. His son was freezing outside while inside the house warmth and comfort reigned. He didn't think, he just acted. He scooped Noah into his arms, the boy's head lolling against his shoulder, and strode to the back door. His shoes left wet prints on the kitchen tiles as he pushed it open with his shoulder. The sudden entrance made both women jolt. Julia's fork froze mid-air, and Elaine's eyes widened at the sight of Mark standing there, his face pale with anger, his coat wrapped around their shivering boy. The room smelled of buttered potatoes and roast chicken, but all Mark could smell was the faint metallic tang of Noah's cold skin. He was behind the shed. Mark said, his voice hoarse but steady. Noah whimpered softly. Julia's lips parted as if to explain, but Mark didn't give her the chance. He placed the boy gently in a chair near the radiator, rubbing his arms quickly, trying to coax back warmth. His gaze flicked between the two women, both pale now, both caught mid-bite. And then, with the weight of a hammer, Mark said 5 words that hung in the air like smoke. The camera caught everything. Outside, the sound of the refrigerator hummed. The television barked laughter from the living room. But in the kitchen, silence dropped like glass shattering. Julia's fork lowered with a faint scrape. Elaine's wine glass hovered inches from her mouth. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just froze mid-bite. Mark's jaw tightened. He had come home expecting warmth. Instead, he had walked into a scene that made no sense, yet promised answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The night had only begun. The kitchen felt heavier than the night outside. Mark's words still hung there, thick and sharp. The camera caught everything. Outside, the radiator clicked as it warmed, a faint hiss of air pushing through the vent. Noah pressed closer to it, wrapped in his father's coat, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Julia's fork trembled as she set it down, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Mark, you don't understand." He was pretending, playing explorer. He wanted to stay out there. Mark turned his head slowly, his jaw locked, so tight it ached. With no blanket and wet socks? At this temperature? Elaine leaned forward, her composure tighter than her daughter's. She placed her wine glass carefully on the table, like a judge laying down a gavel. "Children need discipline. You coddle him, Mark. If you were home more, you'd know he runs and hides when he doesn't get his way. We told him to come in. He refused. He can be manipulative." The words stung, part accusation, part defense. But Mark's eyes didn't leave Julia's face. He knew his wife's tells, the way her shoulders hunched when she lied, how she blinked too often when cornered. She was blinking now, fast, her fingers twisting in her lap. Noah coughed, a thin, raspy sound. Mark knelt to him, touched his forehead. Cool, not feverish, but his skin still carried the clammy chill of cold air. How long? Mark asked without looking up. How long was he out there? Julia's voice faltered. It wasn't that long. A soft whisper broke the air. Mom said I had to stay till the timer beeped. Mark's head snapped toward his son. What timer, Noah? The boy swallowed hard, his lips quivering. The one on her phone. His eyes flicked nervously toward Julia, then dropped to the floor. Julia's face drained of color. She stood too quickly, her chair scraping against the tile. He's making things up, but her phone, resting on the counter, betrayed her. A soft chime pulsed across the screen. Recordings saved to cloud. Backyard clip 1907. Mark's eyes narrowed. Julia snatched the phone up before he could reach it, fumbling to lock the screen. Her knuckles were white. Elaine spoke sharply, filling the silence. Don't you dare make this a spectacle, Mark. You leave for days at a time, and then you come back accusing us of neglect when you don't know the whole story. Mark rose, slow and deliberate, and crossed to the drawer. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He pulled out the thermometer, knelt, and slid it beneath Noah's tongue. Julia hovered at the counter, her breathing uneven. Elaine stared, drilling into Mark like a blade. The thermometer beeped. Mark held it up for them to see. 96.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Not dangerous yet, but low. Too low. Proof that Noah hadn't just been playing games. Mark placed the device on the counter, the beep still echoing in his ears. His eyes lingered on the phone tripod, leaned against the wall, its ring light angled toward the sliding door. Why would they need filming equipment pointing into the kitchen? He tucked that thought away. Julia's voice cracked. You're twisting this. We were going to bring him in. Mark cut her off, his voice quieter than hers, but far steadier. You locked the deadbolt. From inside. He couldn't have come back in even if he wanted to. Elaine stiffened. Julia opened her mouth, closed it again. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, broken only by Noah's faint cough. Mark's stomach nodded. Something darker was buried under this, something carefully constructed. And the only way to get to it was to keep watching, keep listening, and let them reveal what they had planned. He adjusted his coat around his son, keeping his eyes on Julia and Elaine. Start talking. Because from where I'm standing, this doesn't look like discipline. It looks like something else. The women exchanged a look, fleeting, sharp, filled with something more than guilt. Something closer to fear. And in that look, Mark knew this night had been staged. He just hadn't yet figured out why. The silence pressed on the kitchen like a weight. Julia's chest rose and fell too fast. Her hands knotted together, while Elaine sat perfectly still, lips tight, eyes cold, as if daring Mark to push further. Noah curled deeper into the chair near the radiator, clutching his father's coat. His eyes kept darting between the three adults, as though he could sense truths hanging in the air that he couldn't put into words. Mark forced himself to breathe evenly. Rage wouldn't help. He had to watch, really watch. His eyes moved slowly over the room. That's when the details sharpened. The tripod leaned against the wall, its legs extended, the ring light still plugged in. It wasn't aimed at the TV or toward the dining table like someone recording a family moment. No, it was pointed just slightly toward the sliding glass door, angled so the kitchen was framed behind it. A camera's eye on the perfect scene. On the table, 2 plates sat half-finished, food cooling under the warm kitchen air. But in the sink, Mark noticed something else, a 3rd plate. It wasn't scraped clean, just abandoned, mashed potatoes smeared across the edge, green beans left untouched. A plate that had been served for someone who hadn't eaten. Julia followed his gaze and shifted, as though she could block his view of the sink. Mark didn't say anything. He let the silence drag, let the weight of his attention hang heavy on both women. He was good at this, sitting across from people who wanted to spin stories, letting them stumble over their own contradictions. His eyes slid next to the deadbolt on the back door. He stepped over and pressed a hand to it. The lock was engaged. The cold metal told its own story. If Noah had been outside on his own, as Julia insisted, there was no way for him to re-enter. He would have needed someone inside to let him back in. The pieces were starting to align, but the picture didn't make sense yet. Julia finally broke. Mark, stop staring like that. We made a mistake, okay? We let him stay out there too long. We were tired. We weren't thinking straight. Elaine cut in sharp. Don't apologize, Julia. He's twisting this. He always has to be the hero when he shows up unannounced. Maybe if he didn't travel so much, he'd understand how difficult it is raising a child. Mark turned his head, fixing Elaine with a stare. Raising a child means keeping him alive, not locking him out in the cold while you eat dinner. His voice was low, but the edge in it made Julia flinch. A cough rattled from Noah, pulling Mark back to the boy. He crouched down, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. His little hands were still icy, even pressed close to the heater. Dad, Noah whispered, his voice hoarse. She said if I moved, it wouldn't look real. Mark froze. He looked up at Julia slowly. Her lips parted, eyes wide with panic. Elaine shot her daughter a glare sharp enough to cut glass. What do you mean, Noah? Mark asked gently, his voice soft for his son, though his pulse hammered. Noah bit his lip, then whispered, She said I had to stay there till the timer went off. So it would look real, like I was really cold. Julia's chair screeched as she pushed back, standing abruptly. He doesn't know what he's saying. He's confused. Mark straightened, his eyes never leaving hers. No, he knows exactly what he's saying. He looked once more at the tripod, at the third plate, at the cloud notification that had flashed across Julia's phone. Slowly, the fog began to clear. They hadn't just left Noah outside. They had been recording something, crafting a story. And whatever that story was, Mark realized it was meant to destroy him. Julia's voice cracked under the silence. Mark, please don't blow this out of proportion. But Elaine's steady glare gave her away. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan they hadn't expected him to uncover, at least not yet. Mark's jaw set. He pulled Noah closer, the boy's small body pressed against him. His mind worked quickly, piecing every fragment together. Whatever game Julia and Elaine were playing, they'd used his son as a pawn, and he wasn't going to let it go unanswered. The kitchen light hummed faintly, its glow too warm for how cold the air felt between them. Mark stood rigid, Noah clinging to his side, while Julia and Elaine held their seats like guilty jurors. The boy's words still echoed in his ears. She said if I moved, it wouldn't look real. Mark's gaze drifted back to the backyard. Beyond the glass, the shed loomed like a shadowed witness. And mounted just above it, barely visible in the dark, was the small trail camera he'd set up weeks ago for Noah's fox fascination. The memory cut through him, Noah giggling as they scrolled through grainy clips of raccoons and strays, asking if the camera could catch ghosts. Now Mark's gut told him it had caught something else entirely. He shifted Noah gently onto the chair and crossed the room without another word. Julia's voice cracked behind him. Mark, what are you doing? Checking what you didn't think I'd check. His tone was flat, final. Elaine stood abruptly, the scrape of her chair sharp. You can't just. But Mark was already outside, breath fogging in the cold. He crossed the shed, unclipped the trail cam, and slipped it into his coat pocket. The yard was silent, but his mind roared. By the time he stepped back inside, Julia had gone pale. He set the camera on the counter, pulled out the memory card, and slid it into his laptop. Every movement was calm, precise, like loading evidence in a courtroom. Noah leaned forward, eyes wide but uncertain. Julia gripped the counter's edge so hard her knuckles whitened. The screen lit. File list. Timestamp. Mark clicked the most recent one. 6:59 p.m. The video played. The back door opened. Elaine appeared first, holding Noah by the shoulder, his small blanket draped around him. She guided him onto the patio, then, chillingly, pulled the blanket off his body and tossed it back inside. She shut the door. The faint click of the deadbolt sliding was audible even through the grainy audio. Mark's throat burned. He forced himself to keep watching. 2 minutes later, Julia entered frame. She adjusted the tripod inside the kitchen, angled the ring light, and stood before it with her face arranged in a mask of exhaustion. Mark left again. Her voice trembled through the speakers. Noah hides when he's scared. We keep calling him in, but I'm at my limit. We're trying. Then she lifted a plate, deliberately set it in the sink, and pressed her hand to her forehead, like an actor hitting her mark. The clip ended. Mark closed the laptop slowly, every movement deliberate, though his blood thundered in his ears. He lifted his eyes. Julia was trembling now, her lips moving without sound. Elaine's face stayed locked, stiff, but the flicker of panic betrayed her. Noah whispered, "Dad." Mark steadied his voice. This wasn't discipline. His gaze cut through them both. This was theater, and you used him as your prop. Julia's hand flew to her mouth, but no words came. Elaine spoke instead, sharp and cold. You don't understand custody law. You don't understand what happens when you're never home. Judges look at patterns. We were showing them the truth, that you abandon him. The admission hung in the air, poisonous. Mark leaned down, pulled Noah into his arms again, and whispered something only the boy could hear. You're safe. I see it all now. Then, louder, to Julia and Elaine, whatever you thought you were building tonight, it ends here. Because the camera didn't just catch Noah, it caught you. The women froze mid-breath, like actors who suddenly realized the audience wasn't clapping. And Mark knew this was only the beginning. The laptop screen dimmed to black, leaving only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the hiss of the radiator warming Noah's small body. Mark's hand hovered over the closed device, his jaw set, his heart hammering. Julia was trembling, one palm pressed over her mouth as if she could push the truth back inside. Elaine sat upright, her expression a mask carved from stone, but her eyes betrayed a sharp flicker of panic. Then, ding-dong. The doorbell's chime cut through the silence. Julia flinched so hard she nearly dropped her wine glass. Elaine's head whipped toward the hallway. Mark straightened, Noah still tucked in his arms, and moved toward the front door. His pulse quickened. He hadn't called anyone. Whoever stood outside was uninvited. When he pulled the door open, the night air rushed in again. Officer Patel stood on the porch, broad-shouldered in his navy jacket, flashlight strapped to his belt. Beside him was Mrs. Harding, their neighbor from 2 houses down, an older woman with silver hair pulled back neatly, her phone glowing in her hand. Evening, sir, Patel said evenly. We got a call. Your neighbor reported a child outside in the cold for an extended period. Mrs. Harding lifted her phone, her voice taut with disapproval. I saw him from my kitchen window. He was sitting there, shivering. I couldn't stand it. My doorbell camera caught everything. Julia's sharp intake of breath behind Mark was loud enough for everyone to hear. Elaine stood in the hallway now, her arms crossed tightly. Mark shifted Noah higher on his shoulder, his voice steady but low. You'd better come in. Patel stepped inside, Mrs. Harding following close. The officer's eyes swept the room, noting the plates of half-eaten food, the abandoned tripod with its ring light still plugged in, the boy's pale face pressed against his father's chest. Mark gestured to the counter. I just pulled footage off the trail camera. He opened the laptop again, clicking the file without hesitation. Patel leaned in, watching silently as Elaine guided Noah outside, stripped away his blanket, and threw the deadbolt. Then Julia entered frame, adjusting the tripod and delivering her trembling, rehearsed lines. By the time the clip ended, Mrs. Harding's lips were pressed so thin they nearly disappeared. Patel exhaled slowly through his nose. Ma'am, he said, turning to Julia. His tone was flat but firm. Would you like to explain what we just saw? Julia's face crumpled, tears spilling suddenly, as if they'd been waiting just below the surface. It wasn't like that. We weren't trying to hurt him. She looked helplessly at Elaine. Elaine's chin lifted, her voice slicing into the room. You don't need to justify yourself to him or anyone else. This is a family matter. You have no right. Patel cut her off. Locking a child outside in freezing temperatures isn't a family matter. It's child endangerment. And now we have 2 cameras showing it happened. Julia collapsed into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Elaine's jaw clenched tighter, but her silence spoke volumes. Mark held Noah close, brushing a hand over his son's damp hair. His voice was quiet, almost too calm. You try to turn him into evidence. to make me look like the one who failed. Mrs. Harding finally spoke, her voice firm. That boy doesn't belong outside like that. Not for 1 second. I've lived next door for 10 years. I know what I saw. She handed her phone to Patel. On the screen, crystal clear footage showed Elaine nudging Noah toward the shed with her foot, then glancing back at the house before pulling the door shut. The officer's face hardened. He straightened, pulling out a small notepad. I'm going to need to separate everyone for statements. Julia lifted her head, mascara streaking her cheeks. Please, she whispered, don't take him away from me. Patel's eyes softened just a fraction as he looked at Noah, clinging desperately to his father. For now, the boy stays where he feels safe. With his father. Elaine inhaled sharply, as if ready to protest, but Patel's look silenced her. Mark kissed the top of Noah's head, relief and fury warring in his chest. The pieces were coming together. The tripod, the deadbolt, the third plate. They hadn't been accidents. They were steps in a plan. And thanks to the cameras they had forgotten, the plan was unraveling in real time. But as Patel moved to the living room to make his calls, Mark's eyes fell on something else, a manila envelope tucked halfway under a magazine on the counter. Its bold black letters read, Ex parte custody hearing, 9 a.m. The truth sharpened in his gut like ice. This hadn't been careless cruelty. This had been scheduled. And tomorrow morning, it was meant to end his role as Noah's father. The manila envelope seemed to glow under the kitchen light, its edges sharp against the clutter of mail and cookbooks. Mark's stomach twisted as he reached for it. The bold print, ex parte custody hearing. 9 a.m., staring up at him like a sentence already passed. He slid the envelope open. Inside were neatly clipped pages. A petition for temporary primary custody of Noah, citing concerns of neglect due to the father's frequent absences. Attached was a draft request for exclusive use of the residence as the child's primary home. Mark's throat went dry. His eyes flicked to Elaine. She stood rigid, arms folded, her gaze steady and unrepentant. Julia sat slumped in the chair, mascara streaking down her face, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Mark's voice was low, dangerous. This was never about discipline. It was never even about Noah. This was about the house. Julia's head snapped up, her lips trembling. No, Mark, no, I was scared. You're gone so much. I thought if I didn't prove... She broke off, glancing at Elaine as though seeking approval. Elaine's chin lifted. The child deserves stability. Judges care about patterns. Tonight proved he isn't safe with you. That petition would have shown the court exactly what it needed to see. Patel's pen paused over his notepad, his brow furrowed, eyes narrowing. So you admit this wasn't an accident? Elaine's voice faltered for the first time. We were making sure the truth was documented. He's irresponsible. He leaves. Mark slammed the folder onto the counter. The sound made Julia flinch. Irresponsible? I came home early and found my son freezing behind a shed while you sat here, eating dinner. That's not documentation. That's abuse. The officer's radio crackled softly. Patel pressed the button on his shoulder, murmured a code, then looked back at the women. His tone was flat, almost clinical now. I'll need copies of all these documents. I'll need to collect the video files you just saw. Sir, can you send me the trail cam footage? Mark nodded, already plugging the card into his laptop, emailing the files as attachments. The image of Elaine locking the deadbolt filled the preview window again, and for a moment Mark couldn't look away. Noah's small voice broke the silence. Dad! His eyes were glassy, his little hands gripping Mark's sleeve. Are they gonna lock me out again? Mark bent low, pulling him into his chest. No, he whispered fiercely. Never again. Julia made a strangled sound, covering her face. Mark, I swear, I didn't want to hurt him. I thought, if the court saw me as stronger, if they saw you as careless, I could keep him with me. Mom said, Elaine's sharp tone sliced over hers. Stop talking. But Julia couldn't stop. The dam had broken. She told me judges don't listen unless you give them evidence. That if we staged it just once, they'd believe me. I didn't know she'd make him stay out that long. Her eyes welled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands. Patel scribbled quickly, his jaw tight. He looked at Mark, his voice firm. For tonight, here's what's happening. The boy stays with you. Elaine is to leave this property immediately. Julia, you'll have supervised contact until a hearing can determine otherwise. Elaine's eyes flashed. You have no right. Patel cut her off, his tone carrying authority that brooked no argument. I have every right when there are 2 independent videos and a child with a dangerously low body temperature. You'll comply, or you'll be arrested tonight. For the first time, Elaine's voice faltered. Her jaw worked, but she said nothing. She snatched her purse from the counter, her heels striking the tile with clipped, furious steps. Julia sank further into her chair, silent tears streaming, while Noah pressed closer to Mark, his small fingers still trembling. Mark felt the ache of betrayal pressing heavy in his chest, but under it, a cold clarity settled in. The cameras hadn't just saved Noah, they had revealed the scheme. And tomorrow morning, when that courtroom opened, it wouldn't be him on trial. It would be them. The front door slammed behind Elaine, the sound reverberating through the house like a final verdict. For the first time all evening, the kitchen felt wider, emptier, but not lighter. The air was still heavy with everything that had been said, with what almost happened. Julia sat hunched over the table, her hands pressed flat against her cheeks, silent tears slipping between her fingers. Noah nestled tighter against Mark's chest, his breathing shallow, as though afraid that if he spoke too loud, he'd be sent back outside again. Mark smoothed his son's hair, the damp strands clinging to his fingers. The boy's small body was still trembling under the weight of the evening, though the radiator's warmth licked the chill from his skin. Officer Patel spoke into his radio, his voice calm but efficient, confirming that a CPS representative was en route. He closed the notepad he'd been filling, tucking it into his jacket. Mr. Reynolds, he said gently, you and your son will need to remain here until they arrive. We need their report alongside mine. Mark nodded, though his jaw ached from how tightly he was clenching it. He glanced toward Julia. And her. Patel's eyes softened, but his tone was firm. She'll stay for now. CPS will determine the conditions of her visitation. Tonight, no decisions get made without them. Julia looked up at that, her eyes bloodshot, her voice breaking. Mark, I never wanted to go this far. Mom, she convinced me. She said the only way to win custody was to make you look neglectful. I thought, her voice cracked. I thought it would only take one video. One night. I didn't know. Mark's glare stopped her words cold. You didn't know it would hurt him? Julia, you saw his lips turn blue, and you still kept eating dinner. His voice trembled, not with uncertainty, but with fury barely held in check. Noah's small hand gripped his father's sleeve. Dad, I don't want to go with her tomorrow. The whisper was so quiet it barely carried past Mark's ear, but it was enough to harden his resolve. Patel's radio crackled again. 10 minutes later, a knock rattled the door. A woman in a navy blazer stepped inside, her badge clipped to her pocket. Ms. Alvarez, CPS caseworker. Her eyes swept the room quickly, taking in Noah's pallor, Julia's collapse at the table, the tripod still standing in the corner like a silent witness. I've been briefed, she said softly. She crouched down in front of Noah, her voice low, soothing. Hey, sweetheart, can you tell me what happened tonight? Noah's eyes flicked nervously to Julia, then to Mark. Mark nodded, squeezing his hand. It's okay. Just tell the truth. The boy's voice quivered. Grandma put me outside. She took my blanket. Mom said I had to wait until the timer beeped so it would look real. I was cold. Really cold. His eyes watered. I thought maybe I did something bad. Julia crumpled at those words, sobbing into her hands. Ms. Alvarez glanced at Patel, who nodded grimly. Thank you, Noah. You did nothing wrong, she assured him, her voice like balm. She rose and addressed the room. Effective immediately, Noah will remain in his father's care. Ms. Reynolds, you'll be allowed supervised visitation pending the hearing. Ms. Porter will be barred from contact altogether. Julia let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her arms. Mark held Noah close, relief flooding him, but underneath it was a bone-deep ache. He had nearly lost his son, not by accident, but by design. As CPS wrapped up the paperwork, Patel pulled Mark aside. You need to understand how close this was. If you hadn't come home early, if a neighbor hadn't called, the staged video might have been the only version of events the court saw tomorrow. Mark knotted his throat tight. I understand. When the officials finally left, the house felt like it was breathing again, though the shadows seemed sharper, heavier. Mark carried Noah upstairs, tucked him into bed, and sat with him until his breathing evened out. Only when he returned downstairs did he allow himself to sag into a chair. The manila envelope still sat on the counter, its neat pages like the script of a play that had almost succeeded. He stared at it for a long time, then closed the folder with steady hands. This was no longer just about betrayal. It was about survival, his son's, and his own place in his life. And Mark knew the worst of this wasn't over. Tomorrow, the courtroom would decide what happened next. The house was silent after CPS left, but Mark couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the manila envelope in front of him, a cup of untouched coffee cooling by his elbow. Upstairs, Noah finally slept, wrapped under heavy blankets, his breath steady for the first time that night. Julia was still in the guest room, the door shut, her muffled crying leaking faintly into the hallway. Mark flipped open the folder again. The neat legal language mocked him. Temporary custody, exclusive use of residence, pattern of neglect. Every sentence was sharpened to cut him out of Noah's life. He rubbed his temples, rage and disbelief burning under his skin. But Mark wasn't the kind of man to rely only on anger. He was methodical, careful, and as he stared at the envelope, another thought struck him. Evidence leaves trails. He pulled out his phone and opened the smart lock app for the back door. His thumb scrolled through the log. There it was. 6:59 p.m., deadbolt locked from inside. 7:05 p.m., deadbolt adjusted again. Mark's chest tightened. Noah hadn't touched that lock. He couldn't reach it, which meant one of the women had done it. Proof that he'd been trapped outside. He screenshotted the log, sent it to his email. Next, Mark opened the smart thermostat history. At 6:45 p.m., the house temperature had dropped 3 degrees. Elaine's handiwork, no doubt. Lower the heat, make the child shivering look worse for the camera. He saved that too. Every click deepened the pit in his stomach. The plan hadn't been sloppy cruelty. It had been engineered, calculated. They had prepared a narrative for the court. Mark pushed back from the table, pacing. His mind replayed Elaine's earlier words. The house follows the child. At the time, he thought it was just her way of controlling the conversation. But now, seeing the petition, he understood. If Julia won custody, she'd argue that no one needed stability, this house. And with Elaine's debts, the next step will be transferring the property into a trust controlled not by Mark, but by Julia. It was never just about Noah. It was about power. It was about the house. His phone buzzed. A text from Patel. Need all digital logs emailed before hearing. Also forward neighbors' footage. This will help tomorrow. Mark exhaled slowly, his fingers trembling as he attached the files. Trail cam clips, doorbell footage forwarded from Mrs. Harding, lock logs, thermostat history. Each file was a nail in the coffin of Elaine's scheme. Still, unease gnawed at him. Courtrooms were unpredictable. He knew how easily confidence could be twisted, how truth could look like performance if delivered poorly. He glanced at the closed guest room door, Julia sobbing softly inside. Would she hold to Elaine's narrative, or would she break entirely? Noah's voice drifted into his memory. Mom said I had to wait until the timer beeped so it would look real. That sentence alone might decide everything. But Mark hated that it came from his son's mouth. He shouldn't have had to carry such a truth. He checked the clock. Nearly 3 a.m. In 6 hours, they'd stand before a judge. Mark went upstairs, cracked Noah's door open. The boy stirred, but only to mumble in his sleep, "No more cold, Dad." Mark's throat constricted. He tucked the blanket tighter and whispered, "Never again." When he came back down, he found Julia in the kitchen, eyes red, hands shaking around a glass of water. She flinched when she saw him. "I know you hate me," she whispered, "but I didn't want to lose him." "Mom," she said this was the only way. "I swear I never wanted it to go that far." Mark stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Tomorrow, you'll have to choose. Keep covering for her, or tell the court the truth. Because the truth's already on camera. Either you say it yourself, or they'll watch it in silence." Julia's lip quivered. She set the glass down with trembling hands and fled back to the guest room. Mark sat again at the kitchen table, the folder closed, his laptop humming beside it. He felt the weight of the night pressing on him, but beneath it was a clear thread of resolve. The scheme had been clever, but not clever enough. They forgot one thing. He always left cameras running. And tomorrow, those cameras would speak louder than any stage performance. The morning crept in gray and cold, sunlight dulled behind a veil of clouds. Mark hadn't slept. He sat in the living room, Noah curled beside him on the couch, the boy's head resting on his father's lap. Every so often Noah twitched in his sleep, whispering fragments, cold timer, Dad. And each time, Mark's jaw clenched tighter. At 7 a.m., Officer Patel returned, his uniform crisp, his presence steady as ever. Behind him came Ms. Alvarez, the CPS worker from the night before. Julia emerged from the guest room when she heard them, her face hollow from crying, her shoulders sagging as if she'd aged 10 years overnight. Patel spoke first. Court's expecting us at 9. Judge Delaney will be reviewing the petition filed yesterday. His eyes moved to Julia, and everything we collected last night. Julia's gaze fell to the floor. She said nothing. Mark gently woke Noah, who blinked up, confused but calmer than the night before. Where are we going? He asked, his voice still hoarse. To a place where the truth matters, Mark said softly, smoothing his hair. By 8:30, they stood in the family courthouse, the waiting area filled with hushed voices and the shuffle of papers. Julia sat a few chairs away from Mark and Noah, wringing her hands. Elaine hadn't arrived yet. Mark guessed she would appear at the last possible moment, like a general marching into battle. Sure enough, at 8:55, Elaine strode in. Her dark coat was pressed sharp, her heels clicking like hammers against marble. She carried a leather folder tucked neatly under her arm, her chin high, her expression calm, as though last night had never happened. She didn't look at Mark. She didn't look at Noah. She went straight to Julia and whispered something low and harsh. Julia's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't respond. At 9 o'clock sharp, the clerk called the case. The judge, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes, entered. Judge Delaney was known for his intolerance of theatrics. Mark rose with Noah's small hand in his, Patel and Ms. Alvarez at his side. Julia stood too, trembling, while Elaine projected calm strength. The judge's voice was clipped. Petition for temporary primary custody of minor Noah Reynolds, an exclusive use of residence. Filed by Mrs. Julia Reynolds. He glanced at the documents. And I see there are substantial counterclaims filed overnight by law enforcement and CPS. We'll hear both. Elaine rose smoothly, placing a hand on Julia's shoulder before stepping forward. Your Honor, the father is absent for work most weeks. The child is left anxious, fearful, hiding outdoors. Last night was one of many examples. The mother has been forced to take protective steps. Mark's stomach burned, but he stayed silent. Patel leaned forward, sliding a USB across the clerk's desk. With respect, Your Honor, what happened last night was not neglect by Mr. Reynolds. It was a staged event designed to create false evidence against him. The judge's eyes sharpened. Show me. The lights dimmed slightly as the first clip played on the screen. Elaine guiding Noah outside, blankets stripped away, the deadbolt sliding shut. Julia's staged monologue followed, her face arranged into feigned exhaustion. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Julia's breath hitched audibly. Elaine's jaw tightened, her mask of composure cracking for the first time. Then came the second video, Mrs. Harding's doorbell cam. Elaine's foot nudging Noah toward the shed, her furtive glance back at the house. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Mrs. Reynolds, Mrs. Porter, what I see here is not a frightened child hiding from neglect. What I see is adults manufacturing evidence. Julia shook her head frantically. I didn't mean for it to go so far. Mom said. Elaine's hand clamped over her daughter's wrist, but Julia pulled away. No, I can't do this anymore. She turned to the judge, tears spilling. She told me this was the only way, that if I made Mark look like a bad father, the court would give me Noah. She said the house would follow the child, and we'd both be safe. I was wrong. I was so wrong. The judge's gaze darkened. So you admit you knowingly participated in staging evidence of neglect? Julia's sob was the only answer. Mark held Noah close, the boy burying his face against his father's chest. For the first time, the tide had turned publicly. The lies were unraveling, on record under oath. And Elaine, once unshakable, now sat frozen, her silence damning. But Mark knew. The real reckoning was still to come. The courtroom was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector cooling down after the videos ended. Judge Delaney's eyes flicked between Julia's tear-streaked face and Elaine's rigid posture. Mrs. Porter, the judge said at last, his tone cutting. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Elaine rose slowly, smoothing her jacket, her voice calm, though her fingers twitched against the folder she carried. Your Honor, children exaggerate. Cameras can mislead. One night, taken out of context, cannot define years of caregiving. My daughter was overwhelmed, and I stepped in to guide her. Delaney's gaze sharpened. You guided her to lock a 6-year-old outside, in freezing temperatures. Elaine's lips pressed thin. She didn't answer. That was when Patel stepped forward, sliding another packet across the clerk's desk. Your Honor, there's more. Beyond the videos, we found supporting evidence last night. Smart lock logs showing the deadbolt was engaged at the exact times the boy was outside. Thermostat records showing the temperature lowered to exaggerate his shivering. These were not accidents. The judge skimmed the logs, his jaw tightening. Intentional staging, then. Mark felt Noah's small hand tighten around his. The boy leaned into his father, his eyes fixed on the judge, as if willing him to see the truth. But it wasn't over. Mark could feel it. The folder Elaine carried wasn't just for show. He knew what lay inside. Your Honor, Mark said carefully, his voice steady. If I may, I believe there's one more piece the court needs to see. The judge nodded. Proceed. Mark turned, pointing to the manila envelope still tucked under Elaine's arm. That envelope, the one marked ex parte custody. It wasn't just about custody of my son. It contained a stipulation for exclusive use of the residence, tied to Noah's placement, and a side letter, a draft that would transfer control of my home into a trust with Julia as trustee under the guise of stability. For the first time, Elaine's mask cracked. Her hand jerked reflexively, clutching the envelope tighter. Patel's voice cut like steel. Mrs. Porter, I'll need that file. Elaine hesitated, but the judge's glare left no room for defiance. With stiff fingers, she placed the folder on the clerk's desk. The clerk flipped through the pages quickly, then handed them to the judge. Delaney's eyes scanned, his expression hardening with every line. At last, he looked up. This is not just about custody. This is a property transfer scheme. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Julia's face went white. What? She whispered, looking at her mother. You never told me. Elaine's voice hissed low. It was for us. For security. You think he wouldn't throw us out the moment he had full custody? This way, the house stays with Noah, and by extension with you. But Julia shook her head violently, tears streaming fresh. No, Mom. You used me. You used Noah. You wanted the house. This wasn't about keeping him safe. It was about your debts, wasn't it? Elaine froze. The silence was answer enough. The judge slammed his gavel once, silencing the murmurs. Enough. What I see is a deliberate attempt to manipulate this court, to endanger a child, and to exploit custody law for financial gain. His eyes pinned Elaine like a nail. This court will not be used as a weapon. Julia broke down, sobbing openly, her hands clutching her temples. I didn't know. Mark's chest felt heavy, but not with defeat this time, with vindication. All the threads had come together. The cameras, the logs, the stage performance, and now the property scheme. It was undeniable. He wrapped an arm protectively around Noah. The boy's eyes lifted, wide but steady. Dad, he whispered. Mark leaned close. It's okay. The truth's out now. But as the judge's words echoed across the chamber, Mark realized the fight wasn't over. The truth had come to light, but justice would only be decided in the ruling yet to come. The courtroom air was taut, every breath heavy with expectation. Judge Delaney held the side letter aloft, his expression grim. "This document is damning," he said, his voice echoing against the paneled walls. "Not only does it prove an attempt to manufacture evidence, but it also ties the custody petition to an ulterior motive, the seizure of marital property under the guise of child stability." Elaine's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Julia sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking. Mark stood steady, Noah's small hand locked in his. He felt the boy's pulse fluttering against his palm, fast and scared, and he squeezed gently, grounding him. "Here's how this court will proceed," the judge continued, his voice firm. "Effective immediately, temporary sole custody of Noah Reynolds will be awarded to his father, Mark Reynolds. Mrs. Julia Reynolds will have supervised visitation only, to be coordinated through Child Protective Services." Julia lifted her face at that, her eyes wild. "Please, Your Honor, I'm his mother. I made a mistake. I see that now, but don't take him from me." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "Mrs. Reynolds, you didn't simply make a mistake. You participated in a staged act of endangerment. The fact that you now express regret may serve you in future hearings, but tonight's evidence leaves me no choice." Julia collapsed back in her seat, sobbing. Elaine's lips pressed thin, her silence turning into a weapon she could no longer wield. Delaney's gaze shifted to her. "As for you, Mrs. Porter, you orchestrated this. The child will be protected from your influence. Effective immediately, a restraining order is granted. You're barred from contact with Noah until further review by this court." Elaine's nostrils flared, but still she didn't speak. Her eyes flicked once to Julia, disappointment and fury mingling, then back to the judge. The gavel cracked once. "The petition for exclusive use of the residence is denied in full. This court does not reward manipulation." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Patel and Ms. Alvarez exchanged brief, relieved glances. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders loosening just slightly. Noah pressed into his father's side. "We don't have to leave?" he whispered. Mark bent low, his voice soft but sure. "No, son. This is our home." The judge closed his notes. "There will be a full hearing scheduled in the coming weeks to determine long-term custody arrangements. Until then, this ruling stands. Court adjourned." The gavel fell again, final. Julia broke then, sobs spilling raw into her hands. "Mark, please," she gasped, reaching toward him, but he didn't move. His hand stayed firm around Noah's. Mark looked at her, his voice low but steady. "You chose to let him freeze, to make me the villain so you could win in court. But all you did was show Noah what betrayal looks like." Julia's tears doubled, but she had no words. Elaine gathered her folder with jerky motions, her composure gone, her fury simmering under her skin. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching across the floor, and stalked from the courtroom without looking back. Patel touched Mark's arm lightly. "You did the right thing coming forward with everything. It saved your boy." Mark nodded once, his throat thick. He looked down at Noah, whose eyes were wide but calmer now, steady in a way they hadn't been last night. "Come on," Mark whispered. "Let's go home." As they walked out, Julia remained slumped in her chair, sobbing into her hands. For the first time, she looked small, powerless, like someone who had gambled everything and lost not just the case, but her son's trust. And for Mark, the weight of victory felt heavy. Because while the court had ruled in his favor, the cost of what his family had done would echo long after the gavel fell silent. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that sits heavy on the chest. Mark kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on Noah's small hand in the seat beside him. The boy stared out the window, eyes following the blur of trees and rooftops. Every so often, his grip tightened, and Mark would squeeze back, steady and sure. When they pulled into the driveway, the house looked different. The same brick walls, the same sagging shed in the back, but it felt like a battlefield they had just survived. The porch light glowed faintly, as if waiting. Mark carried Noah inside, setting him gently on the couch. The boy curled under a blanket, exhaustion already pulling at his eyelids. Mark brushed his hair back and whispered, "You're safe now. This is still your home." Noah's lips parted in a small smile. Because the judge said so? Mark's chest ached. Because the truth said so. He tucked the boy in upstairs, staying until his breathing evened into sleep. For the first time in days, Noah's face looked peaceful. Downstairs, Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the abandoned tripod in the corner. He unplugged it, folded it, and carried it out to the trash bin. The clang as it landed inside felt final. The ring light followed. The props of betrayal had no place in their home anymore. The door creaked behind him. Julia stood there, eyes swollen, her figure small against the frame. She had been allowed to return to collect some belongings under Patel's supervision, but the weight of distance between them felt insurmountable. "I didn't see it until too late," she whispered, voice cracking. "Mom convinced me I'd lose Noah if I didn't act. She told me the court would never believe me otherwise. I thought I was protecting him, but I wasn't. I hurt him, and I hurt you." Mark's gaze was steady, but his words were quiet. "You didn't just hurt us. You let him freeze to prove a lie. That isn't protection. That's betrayal." Julia flinched as if struck. Tears brimmed again, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked toward the stairs, where Noah slept. "Will he ever forgive me?" Mark shook his head slowly. "That's not for me to answer. That's for him when he's ready. But forgiveness doesn't erase what you did. You'll have to earn his trust back, piece by piece, if he even lets you." Julia pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. After a long moment, she picked up the small bag she had packed and turned toward the door. I'll see him at the supervised visits." Her voice cracked on the word visits. The door shut softly behind her, leaving the house still. Mark exhaled deeply, his chest finally loosening. He walked to the sliding glass door and stared at the shed. The trail camera still hung there, its tiny red light blinking faintly. He unhooked it and carried it inside, setting it on the table. Noah's voice drifted down the stairs, sleepy but clear. "Dad!" Mark looked up. Noah stood there, rubbing his eyes, his blanket dragging on the steps. "Can we still use the camera?" the boy asked. "For the foxes. Not for bad things. Just for foxes." Mark's throat tightened. He crouched, holding his son close. "Yes," he whispered. "Just for foxes. Only for things worth remembering." That night, after Noah returned to bed, Mark sat alone in the kitchen. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt like theirs again. The lies had been dragged into the light, and though the scars would remain, the foundation was stronger for having survived the storm. He closed his eyes, hearing again the words that had shattered the deception. 5 words spoken in the heat of fury, but that had saved everything. The camera caught everything. Outside, and for the first time in weeks, Mark allowed himself to believe they were safe.